So, you've heard the hype about Vite, and you want to get in on the action. Good for you. I guarantee you won't regret it. Since seeing the speed of Vite firsthand, personally, I'm hooked. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First of all, what is Vite? Well, Vite, which is the French word for quick, is a modern build tool created by Evan You. It aims to provide a faster and leaner development experience so that developers can spend less time waiting for their code to compile to preview changes and more time actually developing. In terms of practical application, the closest comparison is probably Webpack or Vue CLI, which uses Webpack under the hood. Developers use Webpack to spin up development servers with hot module reloading and to bundle their apps for production. This is the same thing that Vite does. The difference, though, is how Vite actually works under the hood, and the implications that this has on its speed and scalability. So, how does Vite work? Well, Vite targets two bottlenecks in the traditional development server. The first is the slow server start. When cold starting the dev server, a bundler based build setup has to eagerly crawl and build your entire application before it can be served. Vite, on the other hand, improves the dev server start time by first dividing the modules in an application into two categories: dependencies and source code. Dependencies are mostly plain JavaScript that do not change often during development. They often live in your node modules directory. Vite pre-bundles these dependencies using ESBuild, which is a bundler written in the language Go, and pre-bundles dependencies 10 to 100 times faster than the JavaScript-based bundlers. The other category, source code, often contains non-plain JavaScript that needs transforming, such as CSS or Vue components, and will be edited often. Vite serves source code over native ESM. This is essentially letting the browser take over the part of the job of a bundler. Thus, Vite only needs to transform and serve source code on demand, as the browser requests it. The next bottleneck that Vite solves is that of slow updates. When a file is edited in a bundler-based build setup, it is inefficient to rebuild the whole bundle, for obvious reasons. The update speed will degrade linearly with the size of the app. That is, the bigger your app, the longer the update will take. In Vite, however, hot module replacement is performed over native ESM, thus only the affected file and the files that depend on it need to be updated, as opposed to the entire bundle. This makes hot module updates consistently fast, regardless of the size of your application. Lastly, it's worth mentioning that even though Vite was created by the founder of Vue, it is a framework agnostic tool. That means that while it works great for your Vue projects, it'll also work for React, Svelte, or projects based on other front-end frameworks. This also means that there's an even wider audience of developers that will depend on this tool, ensuring maintained support in the future and a great many hands to make it even better. In conclusion, while knowing the internals of Vite are essential to understanding how it's so fast, there's nothing better than seeing it for yourself. Let's do that in the next lesson. Now that you know a little bit more about the how and the why of Vite, let's use it to start a new Vue.js 3 project. Open up your terminal and type npm init vite at latest and press enter. First, Vite wants us to name our project. We can just go with the default Vite project. Next, we're asked what framework we'd like to use. Remember, Vite is framework agnostic. And since you're watching this video at Vue School, of course we'll choose Vue. Lastly, we could choose to use TypeScript with Vue, but we'll just stick to plain old JavaScript for now. And just like that, Vite has our project set up for us. All that's left to do now is cd into the directory and run npm install. Normally, I'd fast forward the video here so that you wouldn't have to wait for the install to complete. But because Vite is so lean, I don't even have to do that here. And yep, it's already done. That's pretty sweet. To get the development server running now, we can run npm run dev. And notice how fast it was to start. It felt super quick because, well, it was. Vite reports here that it was ready in 290 milliseconds. Awesome. Lastly, opening up the page in the browser, we can see our project boilerplate. I've opened up the project in my code editor, Visual Studio Code. If you'd like to follow along using VS Code, feel free to download it using the link in the description below. However, if you already have an IDE that you're comfortable with, feel free to use that as well. Alright, let's take a look around and see what we've got to start with. The first directory that we see is a .vs Code directory. This is where workspace or project-specific settings for VS Code can be stored. In extensions.js, Vite is recommending that we use the Volar extension for best working with Vue 3 in VS Code. I've already got Volar installed, and I definitely recommend it for working with Vue 3. If you'd like, you can also install it from its extension page at visualstudio.com or from the extensions panel inside of VS Code. Volar provides syntax highlighting for single file components and understands Vue 3 in order to provide some intelligent autocomplete options and other goodies like that. If you aren't using VS Code or don't want to use Volar though, it's not required to use Vite, only recommended for the best developer experience. Alright, the next directory in the file structure is the Node Modules directory. There's nothing new here. This is, of course, where all of our third-party dependencies we install via npm will live. However, I do want to open this up and show you just how little Vite requires out of the box. Wow, there's only like 20 or so different dependencies in here. If you're used to working with Vue CLI, or really on any other JavaScript-heavy project, you know what a difference this really is. The next directory is the public directory. The public directory is where you can store any assets that don't need pre-processing, like a favicon, or sometimes even images or style sheets that you don't need processed at build time. This is exactly the same as Vue CLI. Next, we've got the source directory. This is where the source code of our Vue application will live. And everything in here should be pretty familiar if you're coming from Vue CLI. There's an assets directory for storing assets that need processing, like Sass style sheets or images that might need optimizing. There's also a components directory to store our single file components. There's an app.vue file, which is the root component of our application, which, notice, is using the latest script setup syntax. And lastly, there's a main.js file that serves as the entry point for the app. Alright, finally, in the root directory, we've got a boilerplate.getignore file with some files to exclude from Git in it. Also, an index.html file where we actually include the main.js file. This is the single page that will host our single page application. There's also a package lock and package.json file for keeping up with project dependencies, a README, and finally a vite.config.js file. Vite.config is where we can customize Vite to our specific needs. And in it right now, you'll see that it already includes a plugin to provide the support that we need for Vue. Other than these files, the root directory is pretty bare. We don't have an ESLint RC, or a prettier RC, or some of the other configuration files you might be used to seeing after using the Vue CLI to set up your project. That is, depending on your preferences you use with Vue CLI. Well, remember, Vite takes a little different approach and leaves many of the options that Vue CLI had up to you. However, there are tools used in combination with Vite that make setup feel more like you're probably used to. We'll look at those next. Another option for using Vite for Vue.js applications is to use the tool Create Vue. It provides the interactive command line setup that you're probably used to with Vue CLI. Alright, in order to use the Create Vue tool, we can type npm init vue at next. And this will prompt us with some questions about how to set up the project. We'll call the project Vue Create Example. And now we have the option to choose TypeScript. I'll choose No. We could also install JSX. Again, we don't need that. We could also add in Vue Router. Yeah, why not? We could add Pina for state management. I'll choose Yes. Finally, we have the option of using Cypress for end-to-end testing. I'll just say No. Now, if we copy and paste the printed commands and run them, then we'll get a page up and running. This is an awesome setup experience that probably feels nice and familiar if you're used to working with Vue CLI. However, I'd also like to have ESLint and Prettier set up on our project as well, without having to install them manually. This will ensure that the code throughout our course stays consistently styled. So, in the next lesson, let's take a look at the last option for setting up a project with Vite. Oh, and by the way, you can delete the Vue Create example and the Vite project directories, as we won't be using them during the rest of the course. Instead of starting your new Vite-powered Vue projects with the init Vite command or the Create Vue tool, you might start by using a Vite template provided by the community. In order to find some existing quality templates, you can check out the awesome Vite repo. Under the Templates heading, there are a number of templates listed for Vue 3, Vue 2, and other popular frameworks. We'll be working with Vue 3, so we'll take a look around that section. You can see here that there are a number of possibilities. There's the Vite Vue 3 Tailwind Starter that will get you set up with Vue 3, Vue Router, and Tailwind CSS. There's also a template for building Electron apps, and a number of other really cool templates here depending on your preferences. At the very top of the list is the very popular Vite template called Vitesse. Vitesse was created by Anthony Fu, one of the core Vite team members, and is highly opinionated but full of features, like file-based routing, state management with Pina, Windy CSS, and some other really cool but opinionated things. While Vitesse might be perfect for your next project, I think it might be just a little much for this course though. So, I've created a simpler template for us to use that just includes ESLint and Prettier to help us keep our code well formatted and error-free as we continue with the course. If you stick around for the last chapter of this course, I'll walk you through how I made the template, plus show you how to extend the template to make a more fully featured template that includes Tailwind CSS, Vue Router, and a handy import alias. Alright, I'll install the starter template by going to the GitHub repo linked in the description below, and copying and pasting the install command into my terminal. I'll also change out the name of the project placeholder here with our project name. Let's call it Vite Course. Cool. Now I'll just change into the directory, install the dependencies, and start up our dev server. You'll see now that even with some of our added dependencies, Vite is still lightning fast, starting things up in only 255 milliseconds. Now that we've seen several options for starting a Vue project with Vite, let's dive into Vite's awesome features, starting with styling. Vite provides several different options for including our styles. As you'd expect, we can use a style tag in a single file component. Or we could also create an external style sheet and import it. Let's create a main.css file over in source/assets. And I'll just provide some crazy style in here so that we know things are working. How about the body with the background of blue? Now, for this to actually be included on the page, we now have a couple of different options for where to import it. We could import it into a .vue file like app.vue. And when I save, yeah, that works. And it works instantly without having to refresh the page. Nice. How, though, is Vite actually injecting this? Well, if we go over and inspect the markup, you'll see that Vite has injected a style tag into the head section. Cool. That's one option. Another option is to use an at import statement in the style section of the single file component. And yeah, that works the same. Except now, the styles from the CSS file are included in the same style block as the other styles in the single file component. So, does this mean that if we make the styles scoped, that the imported styles would be scoped too? Well, let's give it a try. Cool. The styles are gone because the body tag does not exist within the scope of the app component. And if we inspect element, sure enough, the body selector has the randomly generated data attribute attached to it, used for scoping styles. That's pretty interesting. Let's go remove that scoped keyword now. It's worth mentioning that when you include styles into a single file component this way, the styles will only ever be loaded when the component is loaded. For components loaded asynchronously, this means that the styles will also be asynchronous. Another cool trick is to apply whole style sheets to only a certain media query. For instance, I could add max width 800 pixels to the end of this import statement. Then, over in the browser, the body background is still blue, but if I resize the page, you'll see that when it goes above 800 pixels, it becomes white. Pretty cool. The most common location you'll see for importing a global stylesheet, though, is in main.js. So let's move our import over there. This still works and is no longer limited by the media query. Okay, what if you wanted to organize your style sheets into different files and use a single main.css file to import them all? That's definitely possible too. I'll create a file called typography.css. And in here, I'll add some styles to the h1. We'll give a color of, let's say, red, and a font size. 3 rim. Then, to include the typography styles, I'll add an import statement in the main.css file. As soon as I save, you can see that the H1 now has our styles. Best of all, this isn't like the add import statement in a regular old CSS file without Vite. There are no extra network requests made. Instead, the styles in main.css and typography are loaded at one time. To show you, let's open the Network tab and refresh the page. In dev mode, this isn't technically a CSS file, so I'll search for .css, and you can see a file called main.css. But when we look at the contents of the file in the response, you can see that it's actually JavaScript, and you can see both styles from the typography.css file and the main.css file together in the same place. In production mode, these will be compiled to a single, regular old CSS style sheet. If you are partial to a particular CSS preprocessor, like Sass, Less, or Stylus, you are welcome to bring those with you to your Vite projects as well. There is no need to install Vite-specific plugins for them. However, the corresponding preprocessor itself must be installed. To demonstrate, let's install Sass. In the terminal, I'll type npm install -d because it's a development dependency, Sass. Then, to prove to you that it's working, I'll rename main.css to main.scss. Then, we'll use a Sass variable to define a color. Lastly, I'll use that variable to style our background. And actually, one last thing we need to do is we still need to rename the file where we've imported it in main.js. Cool. Now we've got a green background, and we know that Sass is working. I find it also really awesome that we didn't even have to restart the Vite process. Sass just automatically started working. Pretty great. Besides SCSS files, we can also use the lang attribute on the style tags in single file components, as you probably would expect. Since this is now SCSS, I can use nesting and style all the p tags inside of the element with the ID of app. Woo! That's some crazy colors, but I think you get the idea. While preprocessors are great, and many of us have grown fond of our own particular flavors, the official Vite docs actually recommend that we use native CSS variables with PostCSS and author only plain future standards compliant CSS. This makes sense, as it makes our styles more hardened to the test of time, and faster to process as less compilation is needed. Let's take that approach. First, we'll uninstall Sass. In the terminal, I'll type npm uninstall Sass. I'll also remove the lang attribute from the style tag in app.view. Then, we'll need to rename main.scss back to main.css and change the Sass variable to a native CSS variable. Lastly, we'll rename main.css in the import. Great, it almost looks the same, except that our paragraph text is no longer orange. That's because CSS doesn't support nested selectors. Yet, anyway. But it is coming, so we can use PostCSS to use the feature right now. Unlike other preprocessors, we don't have to install PostCSS. Instead, we just need to provide a valid PostCSS configuration file, and it will be automatically applied to any valid imported CSS. So, let's create that file. It's called postcss.config.js. I'll leave this empty for just a moment, as we need to go ahead and install the PostCSS plugin, PostCSS Nesting, in order to get nesting set up. In my terminal, I'll type npm install -d PostCSS Nesting. And once that's installed, I'll register the plugin in the PostCSS config file. One thing we will need to change though now is the syntax for nesting. It's slightly different from the Sass style of nesting. Over in app.view, we need to add an ampersand before the nested p selector. Alright, this should get us where we want to be. I'll save, and nothing happened. That's kind of a bummer. Let's restart the dev server real quick. Okay, cool. That did it. To recap, Vite does support your favorite CSS preprocessors, but if you're starting a new project from scratch, it might be worth considering sticking with PostCSS and writing plain, future standards compliant CSS. Before going to the next video, let's also just remove some of these styles, as the page is getting awfully hard to look at. Besides regular CSS style sheets, Vite is also able to handle CSS modules. This is accomplished by adding .module to any CSS file. For example, I'll create a CSS module called example.module.css. If you aren't familiar with CSS modules, they have kind of the same goal as using the scoped keyword on the style tag in single file components. Let's see how that works. I'll target a class here called example and give it the color blue. Cool. Then over in app.view, I'll import the CSS module. Notice we gave the import a name here of styles. Normally, when importing just regular style sheets, you wouldn't do this. You'd simply do the import. Okay, let's console log styles now and see what we get. Now, in the browser console, we can see that styles is an object with the normal class names as keys and hash class names as the values. Alright, so how is this useful? Well, now we can add that hash class name to an element, like this. And now, in the browser, this does indeed give it the proper styling. However, if we inspect the element, we can see that the class applied is the hash version and not .example. so there's no chance that another style in our application might accidentally conflict with the same example class name. In conclusion, CSS modules are just another approach to writing conflict-proof styles. They are not a replacement for scope styles, and you can totally use Vite without them if that's your preference. But they are an interesting option should you choose to use them. Importing a static asset, like an image in Vite, will return the resolved public URL when it's served. Let's take a look at an example. In the script section of app.vue, I'll import the Vue logo from the assets directory and console log it. When we take a look at this in the console, you'll see that we just get a plain simple string. This string represents the public absolute path to the resource. And if I visit that path directly, sure enough, the browser loads up the image. Perfect. While we're in development, the image name is exactly the same as the actual file name. But when we build for production, it'll have a random hash in it to help with cache busting. Let's see that real quick. To build our application, we can stop the dev server and then run npm run build. Then we'll also run npm run serve. And what this command does is allow us to preview our built app locally. Notice here that the port on the link is different than that of the dev server. In my case, it's 5000, and it'll probably be the same for you as well, if that port isn't already busy. So just don't let that confuse you. If I were to refresh our page here on the right now, yeah, it'd break, because it's still looking for the development server at port 3000. Let's just change it to 5000 in the URL to see our built app. Cool. This time when we look at the console log, you'll see the file name has a cache busting hash in it, and we didn't have to do anything extra to get that. Pretty sweet. Once again, visiting that URL directly in the browser, sure enough, we get the logo. Another thing to notice is that when referencing assets in the template area of a single file component, Vite actually automatically converts these into imports, such as when the logo is used in the image tag. If we inspect the logo on the built production site, once again, we see the hash. Nice. One thing worth noting about this auto importing is that it only works when the image path is hard coded in the template area. If you were to store it in a variable and reference that variable in the template, it would not work. This has bit me before, so let me show you. I'll comment out our import of logo and remove the console log. Then, I'll create a variable called logo in the script section and assign the Vue logo's path to it. Then, I'll reference that variable in the template where it was previously hard-coded. Now, if I stop my preview server and rerun the development server, and visit it at the proper port in the browser, yeah, you'll see that the image no longer works. Okay, so how do we fix this? Well, we have a couple options. We could reinstate the import we just commented out and use it instead. Sweet. Yeah, that works. Another option is to use a native URL constructor combined with the native ESM feature import.meta.url. And that looks something like this. Doing this allows us to obtain the full resolved URL as a static asset using a relative path from the current JavaScript module. This actually works natively in modern browsers, meaning that Vite actually doesn't need to process this code at all during development. Cool, that's a big plus for speed. This approach can also be really useful when the paths of your static assets are more dynamic and can't be hard coded directly in the file. Nice. I'll just hard code it again in the template though, since we do know the file path isn't dynamic in this case. Alright, if you ever have any images that you don't need processed at all, or don't want to have the file name hashed in production, you could put those images in the public directory. To demonstrate, let's move the Vue logo to public. Now, instead of referencing it via a relative path, we need to use the absolute path instead. The absolute path is in relation to the public directory. So, ./assets slash logo.png becomes slash logo.png. Cool. And you can see the image now working on the development server. Also, if I stop the development server, run build, and start up the preview server again, when I visit the proper URL in the browser and inspect the element, you'll see that the image name doesn't include the hash. It's the file name exactly as we saved it in the file system. Awesome. Finally, let me show you one more feature that Vite provides before we wrap up this lesson on images. Alright, in the video's description below, you'll find a link to a tiny version of the Vue logo. You can download it and use that image for this portion. I've got it right here on my file system already though, and it's only about 3K. So let's move that file into the assets directory of our project. Then we can import that for our image tag. Once again, I'll stop the preview server, rebuild the app, and rerun the preview server. This time, when we inspect the image tag, instead of the source being a URL, and whoops, let's refresh the page. Yeah, this time it's a base64 encoded image. Vite does this automatically for us for any image that's under 4 kilobytes, or any other size that we choose to configure it for, and we'll see how to configure that in a later lesson. What this does, though, is save our application from making round trips to the server for data that could be downloaded alongside the rest of the page. It's just one more way that Vite makes things fast, not just for us, the dev, but for our end users as well. I've got my dev server up and running again with npm run dev. Now, let's take a look at how Vite handles JSON files. First, we need a JSON file to work with, so I'll create one in the source directory. I'll call it data.json. Then, we'll need to create a little data. So we've got a key of framework set to Vue, build tool set to Vite, of course, and then finally, developer mood is happy, happy, happy. Now, the question is, what happens when we try to import this? Well, let's find out. In app.vue, I'll import it, and then console log the results. Now, when we view this in the browser and open up the console, you can see that we've got a real JavaScript object logged instead of a JSON string. Pretty sweet. So, under the hood, Vite automatically parses our imported JSON files. But Vite actually goes one step further than that. We can even import a root field from the JSON as if it were a named export. For instance, let's say that we only wanted to grab developer mood. Well, we could do that. If we take a look in the console now, and just so it's clear, I'll give the page a refresh here. Yeah, only happy, happy, happy is logged. But what about once we've bundled the app for production? What happens to the build tool and the framework since we aren't using them? Well, Vite can actually tree shake that data. Let's take a look. I'll stop the development server, run the build, and then start up the preview server. Now, when I visit localhost 5000 in the browser, if I open up the network tab and refresh the page, and I'll just remove this filter here, you can see that we have an index dot some kind of hash here dot .js. This is our bundled JavaScript. Let's open that up and examine it. If I look for the string of happy in here, sure enough, I find happy, happy, happy. But if I search for the string of course, which was part of the build tool value, yeah, it's nowhere to be found. Vite knows it's not used, and thus it doesn't burden the end user with having to download it. Perfect. Vite supports importing multiple modules from the file system via the special import.meta.glob function. So, let's say we had a directory called auto imports. Then, inside of this directory, we have two files. I'll call the first one file1.js, and the second one, you guessed it, file2.js. Each file will just contain a console log, letting us know that the file is in fact included and running. Next, over in main.js, I'll create a variable called auto-imported-modules. To set its value, I'll use import.meta.glob. This function takes a glob pattern for matching a certain set of files. We'll target all the JS files in the auto imports directory. Now, let's just console log auto imported modules to see what we get. Okay, that's actually pretty cool. We've got the two file names as the keys, and then a function that dynamically imports the modules as the values. That means that we should be able to loop over the properties of this object and run the dynamic import for each of them. Let's give that a try. I'll give the browser a reload just to clear up the console. And, sure enough, in the console we get the logs from the two auto-imported files. Very nice. I think it's important to notice here that the console logs from the files do come after the happy 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 message from the last lesson though, even though we're running this code in main.js before the Vue app is ever created. That's because the files, matched by the glob function, are actually loaded asynchronously, and they'll be split up into separate chunks at build time. If you need the files to be imported and run synchronously though, you can run the glob eager function instead. And since there are no more dynamic imports to call, we can actually remove the loop altogether. I'll save, and then when I refresh the page again, this time the console logs from the files are first, and the happy 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 message is after. Vite supports TypeScript out of the box, so all that's really necessary to start using it is to install it. I'll type npm install -d TypeScript. Now we can rename our main.js file to main.ts. Then, where it's being linked in the index.html file, we'll also need to update that as well. In the browser, you'll see that everything is still working just fine. I'll even give the page a refresh just to make sure. Yep, still all good. In our editor though, things aren't looking as great. We've got some red squiggly lines there on line 2 and line 5 of main.ts. The reason is that just because Vite supports TypeScript out of the box doesn't mean that it's necessarily configured and set up to work best with Vue. During the setup step in an earlier lesson, if we had chosen to use Vue-ts, the scaffolding would have included the necessary TypeScript setup. But we didn't do that, as we wanted to stick with plain old JavaScript for the majority of this course. So, now let's configure things manually together. First, we'll install Vue-tsc, which is a type checking tool for Vue. Then, we'll add a tsconfig.json to the root of the project. And I'll just paste some options in here. We won't go over all the options, but just know that the way that I got these was simply by running npm init vite at latest, like we did to create this project, but to create a new project, and instead of choosing regular Vue, I chose Vue-ts instead. And this was the tsconfig that was generated, so I just stole it from there. Next, we need to create a TypeScript declaration file, env.d.ts, in the source directory. Once again, I'll just paste in the contents, which, by the way, I got the same way as the tsconfig. First, it shims the environment of client-side code, since Vite's default types are for its Node.js API. Secondly, it lets TypeScript know how to understand Vue's single-file components. Alright, lastly, ESLint is going to cause us a few issues competing with TypeScript to show errors via the red squiggly line in VS Code. We could go through a few steps to make them work together, but for simplicity's sake in this course, and not to get off topic of Vite, I'll just disable ESLint for now by deleting its config file. Alright, with those things set up, if we go back over to the main.ts file, we still have one of the errors showing, but I think we just need to reload VS Code so that it kind of takes hold of that tsconfig.json and implements them correctly. Cool. Now all of those red squiggly lines are gone. Also, if we want to use TypeScript in our single file components now, we can. Let's see that in app.view. I'll add the lang attribute to the script tag and assign it the value ts. Now we can do something TypeScripty. Maybe we'll remove that developer mood import from the data.json file. And instead, now we can define it with an explicit string type. Very nice. Works like a charm. In conclusion, it's worth noting that Vite only performs transpilation on .ts files and does not perform type checking. It assumes type checking is taken care of by your IDE and your build process. Just like any other build tool you're used to working with, Vite has a number of configuration options to help you customize it to your liking. Let's take a look at a few of those options in this lesson. First, I've got open the vite.config.js file. This is where you'll provide all the configuration options for Vite. Let's start out by taking a look at the resolve.alias option. This option allows us to create import aliases for the project. What is an import alias, you ask? Well, if you're coming from Vue CLI, then you probably remember the @ import alias. It allowed us to write imports something like this. The @ in this case was an alias for the source directory. Let's configure Vite to support the same alias. But first, let's confirm that it's not already a feature of Vite and already working. To do that, let's move this import statement to app.view. And replace the import statement that's already there for Hello World. Now, in the browser, we've got this awful looking error. It says that it failed to resolve import. Okay, so let's set up the alias now. The way we set up an alias is to define the string we want to use for the alias as the key. And in our case, that would be the @. Then, the value is the absolute path of the directory that we want the alias to represent. I'll use the node module path and the global variable dir name in order to get that. Cool. That gets us to the project root, so now we just want to nest down one more directory to the source directory. Lastly, of course, we'll need to import the path module. Once we save that, and then go over and refresh our page, oh, we've got an issue here. I think the server stopped because that path module wasn't defined. So we'll just restart it. Sweet, that's better. And now our import alias is working. Another useful option for configuring Vite is the build.assets inline limit option. Here, we can specify the file size to start inlining images at with base64 encoding, like we talked about in the images lesson. It defaults to 4096, which is the binary equivalent of 4 kilobytes. But you could specify any number you'd like here to start inlining images at smaller or larger sizes. Or, if you'd like to turn off inlining images altogether, then you can set this option to 0. Sweet! Another build option is the CSS code split option. This is for enabling or disabling CSS code splitting in the build project. When it's enabled, CSS imported async chunks will be inlined into the async chunk itself and inserted when the chunk is loaded, making it so that CSS is only downloaded when it's needed. This is the default behavior. If instead you'd like to include all the CSS from the project into a single CSS file, you can turn this off. The last option that I'd like to take a look at together is the source map option. By default, source map is set to false. This means that no source maps will be generated for production, which is usually what's desired. We want source maps during development to help debug things, but we really don't want end users to have to download that irrelevant data. We can, however, change this if we need to. By setting this to true, separate source map files will be created for our built chunks, and linked from the chunks via source map comments. If we provide the value inline though, the source map will be appended to the resulting output file as a data URI. Lastly, we could also use the value of hidden. This works like true, except that the corresponding source map comments in the bundled files are suppressed. This can be useful when you want the source maps to be able to send them to some kind of tool like maybe Sentry for your application monitoring, but don't need them to show up in the browser DevTools for your production site. Alright, let's remove all these build options, as I think the defaults will work best for us. In conclusion, these are only a small number of the options available for customizing Vite's behavior. If you'd like an explanation of all the available options, you can visit the link to the config page on the official Vite docs. I've got it linked in the description below. At this point, we've seen how easy and fast it is developing with Vite. And to be honest, most everything is pretty intuitive, and there's not a whole lot that doesn't just work. Development, though, is just the first step in building an application. Eventually, you do have to launch the thing. Alright, in this lesson, let's take a look at building our application for production. We've already used the command to do this. Remember, it's npm run build. When we run this command, Vite actually uses the module bundler rollup under the hood to bundle all our JavaScript modules into common chunks. But why is this necessary when using native browser support for ES modules worked great in development? Well, the reason, according to the official Vite docs, is because even though native ESM is now widely supported, shipping unbundled ESM in production is still inefficient, even with HTTP2, due to the additional network round trips caused by nested imports. Thus, to get the optimal loading performance in production, it is still better to bundle your code with tree shaking, lazy loading, and common chunk splitting for better caching. Cool, that makes sense. So, after running the build command, we end up with a dist directory with our JavaScript modules bundled into common chunks. Now, you can serve the dist directory locally to preview the built site using the serve command we saw earlier. That is, npm run serve. Or, you can upload the dist directory to your favorite hosting provider to make it available to the world. Finally, if you need help getting the build set up on your hosting provider of choice, the official Vite docs have step-by-step instructions for a number of the most popular hosting providers. And that's all there is to getting your site built for production. Oftentimes, it's useful to have some variables set to different values depending on the environment your project is running in. For example, you might use an API key for a test account in your headless CMS during development, but use a different API key in production. That way, you don't accidentally alter production data while you're developing. This is where environment variables come in. Environment variables in Vite are accessed via an import.meta.env object. With the development server running, let's console log that and see what it looks like by default. Nice! So we've got an object with some default environment variables automatically provided by Vite. First is the base URL the app is being served from. This is configurable via the base option in the Vite config file and can be changed if the root of your app isn't the same as the root of your server. Dev means we're running in development mode. Likewise, prod false also means that we're running in development mode, and both of these would be reversed if we were running the preview server instead of the dev server. Lastly, mode gives us a string version of the environment we're operating in. When running the dev server, this will always be development. After running the build, this defaults to production, but can also be changed to values like stage, staging, test, or really anything you'd like. This is possible by passing the mode flag to the build command. Notice the output in the terminal now reads building for staging. Sweet! These built-in environment variables can be very useful, but we can also define our own environment variables. To define our own, Vite supports using a .env file. So let's create one. Within the .env file, we can define our variable names in all caps by convention. And then set them equal to whatever value we'd like. And on each new line, we can provide different variables. If I save the file and look back at the console log in the browser, you'll see that our new environment variables aren't included. This might be a little surprising at first, but this is actually a feature of Vite to help us from accidentally exposing sensitive values to the client. So, if you have any environment variables that can be exposed to the client, you must prefix said variable with Vite underscore. And I'll just do it for both of these. Great! Now they both show up in the console. Now, if we were to build for production, these variables would be statically replaced in the final bundle. Let's see what that looks like. I'll run npm run build. And then, in the resulting dist directory, under assets, and then this index.somekindofcrazyhash.js, if I search for one of the variables, yeah, you can see where the value has been inserted as a static value. While we're here, you can also see that mode is production. Let's run the build command once more with the mode flag set to staging, just so you can see that change in the generated file as well. I'll click up in my terminal a few times to get back to the command we ran a few moments ago where the mode was set to staging. Then I'll open the newly generated JavaScript file and search for mode real quick. Nice. This time it says staging. Alright, a .env file is not the only place that you can register these environment variables. In the Vite docs, you can see a number of variations on the .env file like .env.local and .env.mode. These can be very useful, depending on if you want the values to be stored in your Git repo or not, and in which mode, like development, production, staging, and so on, that you want the values to be stored for. So read the docs for more info on these if you'd like to use them. Lastly, these variables could even be defined somewhere in your host's admin dashboard, depending on your host. For instance, Netlify provides an interface for storing environment variables like this. Just remember, those values will be statically inserted at build time. So, if you're wanting to set the variables directly on your host, your project will need to be built by your host as well. At this point, if you're convinced that Vite is right for you, how do you go about migrating your projects started with Vue CLI to use Vite instead? Well, in order to answer that question, let's build a brand new project with Vue CLI, and then go through the steps to convert it to Vite. Of course, you wouldn't typically be starting with a brand new Vue CLI project. However, many of these steps will be the same for your established projects. Alright, to create a new Vue CLI project, I'll run Vue create. And we'll name the project Vue CLI to Vite. Now, if this command didn't work for you, it means that you don't already have Vue CLI installed, in which case this lesson probably isn't for you anyway, nor is any of this chapter, so you can skip it if you'd like. But if this command doesn't work for you and you still want to follow along anyways, then I've left a link in the description below to the Vue CLI docs to help you get it installed. Alright, at this prompt I'll choose Manually Select Features. Next, I'll add Router and CSS preprocessors to the already selected options. Here, we'll choose Vue 2, as most of you probably have your well-established codebases still running on Vue 2. However, this process is very similar for Vue 3, and I'll point out the minor differences as we go along. I'll choose Yes here for Router History Mode, and here I'll choose SAS/SCSS with Dart SAS. Next, for linting and formatting, we'll do ESLint plus Prettier. Here, I'll choose Lint on Save. And lastly, we'll use dedicated config files. Oh, and we won't save this as a preset. As you could tell during the setup here, these options are quite opinionated. And so, once again, the migration steps I'm about to show you probably won't be the exact same for you and your established projects. However, many of the steps that I am going to show you will be roughly the same, and you'll get a good general idea of the actions you should take. Awesome. In the next lesson, we'll be going through the 9 steps that it will take to complete the migration. Oh, and by the way, notice that Vue CLI hasn't even finished initializing the project yet. Kind of makes you appreciate Vite just a little bit more, doesn't it? Alright, I've got the Vue CLI project opened up in my code editor, and we're ready to start migrating. The first step to migrating to Vite is to update the dependencies in package.json. First, we'll need to remove the Vue CLI related dependencies. We can also remove the SAS loader here, as Vite provides built-in support for the most common preprocessors out of the box. And even with this removed, we can continue to use SCSS in our project. I'll make sure to save the file, and now we'll add Vite as a dependency. I'll do this through the terminal with npm. I'll type npm install -d Vite. Besides Vite itself, we'll also need the Vite View plugin in order to support single-file components. We'll install the community-maintained Vue 2 version of it though, since we're migrating a Vue 2 project. But if you have a Vue 3 project, you'd use the official Vite View plugin instead. Nice! With the Vite plugins installed, we can now also remove the Vue template compiler, as that's handled by the Vite View plugin. Lastly, I'll run npm prune to delete the packages I removed from package.json. Since Vite is a next-generation build tool, let's proceed optimistically by only supporting the most modern browsers. This will keep our builds as lean and as fast as possible. Practically speaking, this means that we can remove Babel completely from our dependencies, as most mobile and desktop Evergreen browsers have near full support for all ES6 features. If you still need to support older browsers like Internet Explorer 11, Vite does provide an official plugin for that, and I've left a link to it in the description below. So, to remove Babel, first we'll delete the babel.config.js file. Next, since we already removed the Vue CLI plugin for Babel that requires Babel itself, now we just need to remove a couple other Babel-related dependencies from package.json. Those are Babel ESLint and core.js. With Babel ESLint now removed, we also need to remove it as a parser from our .eslint.rc file. Lastly, while we're in this file, we also need to update the env from Node to ES 2021. Since, of course, we're only supporting those Evergreen browsers. This change will also force us to update ESLint itself, as well as the ESLint plugin view package, to support the ES 2021 environment. And we can just do that with npm. I'll type npm install eslint at 8 eslint-plugin-view at 8. And after that finishes installing, I'll also run npm prune once more, as we did remove more packages from the package.json file. Step 3 is to provide our Vite config. To do this, we'll create the vite.config.js file in the root of our project. Then, I'll paste in the default Vite config for a new Vite-powered Vue project. At this point, we'll need to modify just a couple things. First, we'll need to import the Vue plugin from Vite-plugin-vue2 instead of the official Vite Vue plugin. And in this package, the export is actually called create Vue plugin, so we'll alias that as Vue. Of course, if you're using Vue 3, you wouldn't have had to do this. Secondly, in order for the @import alias to work, as it did with Vue CLI, we need to set the resolve.alias option that we learned about in a previous lesson. The last step that we'll take in this lesson is to move the index.html file from the public directory where Vue CLI likes to keep it to the root of the project. Also, inside of index.html, you'll want to make a few changes. First, we'll change the instances of this placeholder to hard-coded values. Since these placeholders really weren't overly useful, I don't mind just hard-coding them here. Also, we'll need to replace the base URL placeholder with an absolute path. Lastly, the JavaScript application is no longer auto-injected, so we need to include it like this. Sweet! We're about halfway done now. Let's finish up in the next lesson. In this video, let's finish migrating our project from Vue CLI to Vite. Here we are at step 5, and that step is to update the npm scripts and change them from the Vue CLI service commands to the Vite specific commands. We'll start with dev. This, of course, is the command to spin up the dev server, and under the hood just calls the Vite command directly. The next one is build, which calls Vite build and builds our project for production. Then comes serve. This is the command that Vite uses to spin up a preview of the built project. Do note that this is different than the way Vue CLI used it. With Vue CLI, you would use the serve command to spin up your dev server, but that's not the case anymore with Vite. Also, since we've got linting in our project, we should update the lint script to run ESLint directly, instead of using the Vue CLI ESLint service that it used previously. And we'll pass just a few options to make ESLint work best with our project. We'll tell it to lint files with the extension of .js and .vue. We'll also share the .getignore file with ESLint in order for it to ignore the same things. And then lastly, we'll tell it to fix the source directory. The next step in updating our project from Vue CLI to Vite is to update the environment variables. There is a lot of crossover between the way environment variables work in Vite and how they work in Vue CLI. For instance, your .env naming convention can all remain the same. However, you can no longer access environment variables on a process variable, like here in the router file. Instead, they can be found on import.meta.env. Also, the Vue_app_ prefix used to make declaring client-exposed env variables more apparent is changed to Vite_. So, if you have any such environment variables, you'll have to update them accordingly. Step number 7 is to add .vue extensions to all your single file component imports. While our newly created Vue CLI project already does this, my bet is that your existing applications probably do not. So, you must ensure that all imports of single file components end with the .vue extension. If this process is too overwhelming due to the size of your code base, you can configure Vite so that it isn't required. This is accomplished by adding .vue to the resolve.extensions config option in the config file. However, you must also make sure to manually include all the default extensions as well, as this option overrides the default. While this works, it should be avoided if at all possible. Why? Because according to the Vite docs, note, it is not recommended to omit extensions for custom import types, since it can interfere with IDE and type support. Step number 8 is to clean up all those magic comments used for naming our dynamic imports, as these are Webpack specific comments and don't mean anything to Vite. So what does Vite do instead to help us identify these chunks? Well, instead, Vite automatically names our chunk based off of the original .vue file name, combined with a cache-busting hash. After completing steps 1 through 8, our application is ready to start running with Vite. Let's run npm run dev and see what happens. Sure enough, the server starts up successfully. And when I visit the page in the browser, it works too. Awesome. To be thorough though, let's also build the app and run the preview server. Whoops, that should be serve. Sweet, that works too. While I know all of these steps won't be the exact same for your existing projects, since all of them are different, these 9 steps should get you at least most of the way from Vue CLI to Vite. At this point, you've learned pretty much everything you need to know to be successful with Vite. However, we can make Vite even more useful by learning how to standardize some things across different projects. The first strategy that I want to talk about is Vite templates. We've already seen some useful existing templates. But what if there isn't one available already that fits your needs or preferences? No problem. You can create your own. Let's walk through the process by creating a handy Vite template that includes Vue 3, Vue Router, ESLint, Prettier, and Tailwind CSS. Since the Create Vue tool can install Vue 3 and Vue Router for us automatically, let's start there. In the terminal, I'll type npm init vue at 3. The project name here will be my Vite template. We'll use plain JavaScript, and we don't need JSX support. We will add Vue Router and pass on Pina. We'll also pass on Cypress. And actually, even since planning this lesson, the Create Vue tool has added in support for ESLint and Prettier, so we can auto set up those as well. Okay, that's got the project started. Now I'll open up the project in VS Code. Great. So now that we've got 4 out of the 5 pieces set up for us automatically by the Create Vue tool, all that's left now to do is install Tailwind CSS. To do this, we can follow the install instructions from the official Tailwind docs. The first step here is to set up the project, which we've already done. Step 2 is to install Tailwind. I can copy the commands to do that by clicking the clipboard icon here and pasting it into my terminal. Cool. In step 3, we'll configure the template paths to let Tailwind know where all to expect Tailwind CSS classes to be used. That way, the JIT compiler can properly create the styles. Once again, we can copy this from the docs. And we'll paste it into the Tailwind config file. You'll notice here that ESLint is complaining about the module with the squiggly red line. That's because it thinks it's undefined. In order to fix this, we'll provide a special ESLint comment just to let it know that we're running this file in Node. Cool, that takes care of the error there. Now, step 4 is to add the Tailwind directives to our CSS file. Once again, I can copy them. And our main CSS file lives in source, assets, base.css. So I'll paste them here. Alright. Step 5 isn't necessary, as the base.css file has already been included in the project. Next, we just need to start up our development server by running npm run dev. Let's see what it looks like in the browser now. Awesome. There's the boilerplate template. But now let's use Tailwind to make sure that it's installed correctly. In hello-world.view, I'll use a Tailwind class to change the text from green to blue. Awesome. Tailwind is working just as we'd expect it to. Our text is turned blue. With Tailwind now part of our Vite template, next time we want to create a project, we won't have to manually install Tailwind and get it set up again. Alright, now let's make our template quickly available for starting new projects. To do that, I'll initialize a Git repo for the project. If you aren't familiar with Git, then you could just manually copy and paste this project directory whenever you want to start a new project. But I highly encourage you to get familiar with Git, as it will pop up a lot during your development career. Alright, now I'll add everything to the staging area and commit. Awesome. Now I'll create a remote repo in GitHub for this template. In GitHub, I'll give our repository the name myViteTemplate. And it can be public. And then finally, I'll create the repository. We've got an existing repository, so I'll copy this second option. And then we can paste it into the terminal in our project. Great! Now our project is available on GitHub. If we wanted to be more thorough, we'd probably want to update the README here as well, and tell users what all features our template has, and how to use it. And speaking of how to use it, what's the best way for us to now use that template? Well, we can do that with the handy Digit tool. That works by going to our terminal and typing npx digit the GitHub username / the name of the repo. This is much faster than cloning the repo because you're not downloading the entire Git history. And we can provide a new name for the project as well. Now, I can cd into my project, install the dependencies, and start up the dev server. Sure enough, we've got all the features of the template, and now all it takes is running a single command to consistently start opinionated new projects. In conclusion, what we've done with our template certainly isn't the limit. You can do whatever you want in your templates. You could provide a default set of styles, maybe some default pages, or whatever might be the same between your various projects. Also, if your template might be useful to others, you could even make a PR to the Awesome Vite repo and share your templates with the whole Vue community. Vite comes with a plugin system, allowing it to be easily extended to handle lots of different use cases. In fact, we've already used one Vite plugin in this course. That is the official Vue plugin that provides support for single-file components. To use it, first we installed it as a dependency. And actually, the bootstrapping process did that for us, but you get the idea. Then we had to import it into the viteconfig.js. And lastly, used the plugins option to register it. Besides the Vue plugin though, there are several other official Vite plugins maintained by the Vite core team that provide support for JSX and Vue, React, and support for legacy browsers. Likewise, there are also plenty of community-maintained plugins in the Awesome Vite repo. For instance, there are a number of plugins that are framework agnostic, like the Vite plugin PWA for a zero config PWA, or Unplugin Icons, which provides access to thousands of icons as components. Then, there are also some plugins that work for specific types of projects, like Vue or React. For instance, there's a Pages plugin for Vue that generates routes based on the file system. Or this Markdown plugin that allows you to import Markdown files as Vue components and Vue components into Markdown. All of these plugins have docs that walk you through setting up the plugin, using it, and customizing it via different options. Finally, it's worth mentioning that Vite plugins are an extension of Rollup's plugin interface, and thus a fair number of Rollup plugins will work directly as a Vite plugin. You can see the link in the description below for more info about Rollup plugin compatibility. So, there you have it. Now you have a ton of different options in order to extend Vite in the same way across multiple different projects, using official and community-provided plugins. As we saw in the last lesson, there are some really great existing Vite plugins available. And if one exists that solves your problem, then great, no need to reinvent the wheel. But, in case you can't find a suitable plugin for your needs, I'd like to briefly show you how to create a simple Vite plugin for yourself. As an example, let's create a simple Markdown to Vue component Vite plugin. The plugin will allow us to have a Markdown file, like this. And we'll add a heading of Hello World, and then maybe a paragraph. This is some Markdown. Then, we could import it as a Vue component, like this. In app.vue, I'll import my Markdown from the source directory /mymarkdown.md, and then use it in the template as a component. Looking in the browser now, yeah, we can see that this doesn't work. Okay, let's create the plugin. Inside the Vite template we created earlier, let's create a new file called Vite plugin vuemd.js. It's a convention to prefix your Vite plugin names with Vite-plugin. And if it's meant to only work with a specific framework, to include that framework name after Vite plugin, like we did. Notice that while we're working on the plugin, the source code can live right here in our project. Alright, step 1 in this file is to export a function that accepts some user options. These user options will allow the user of the plugin to customize it with certain settings, and we'll put it to use in a minute. Next, we'll return the plugin object that allows us to pass certain information on to Vite about our plugin, and also hook into particular parts of the Vite lifecycle. First, in this object, we'll provide the name of the plugin. This name is required and will show up in warnings and errors. Next, I want to use the enforce option to tell Vite that this should be one of the earlier plugins that runs. The pre value here tells Vite to run this plugin before 1. The Vite core plugins, 2. User plugins without the enforce value, and 3. The Vite build plugins. If we had used post, it would force the plugin to run after those steps. This is important for our use case because we will be dumping the Markdown into the template of a virtual Vue file that we want the Vue plugin to then handle, as it would any normal Vue file. Thus, we want our plugin to run before the Vue plugin. Okay, so now the question is, how do we actually spit out this template? Well, to do that, we need to use the Vite transform hook. Transform receives two arguments, the raw file contents and the file ID. For files that really exist in the file system, this ID is the file name with its absolute path. However, this transform hook runs for every single file being imported in our project. So, let's limit it to only apply to the files ending with the Markdown extension using a regular expression. Then, we can return that view template with the raw file contents inside. As is, this would only spit out the raw Markdown into the template. In order to parse the Markdown into HTML, let's install and use the open source package Marked. First, I'll install it. npm install -d marked. Then we'll import it and use it in the plugin. Great! That just about does it for the basic functionality of the plugin. But, just to show you how a user option might work, let's make the wrapper element that's hard-coded as a div here configurable by the plugin user. First, I'll provide an option wrapper element and give it a default value of div. Then I'll extract the wrapper element using object destructuring. And alias it to L, just for brevity's sake. Lastly, I'll replace the hard-coded divs with the L variable. Very nice. All that's left to do now is actually use the plugin. Open up the vite.config file and import our custom plugin. Now we can use it in the plugins option. Also, one more thing actually. Since we're relying on the Vue plugin to take the template from the Markdown file, we'll also need to tell the Vue plugin to include a file type that it doesn't normally process. We can do that with the Vue plugin include option. And I think this is a perfectly acceptable solution, as this is actually exactly what one of those community templates for Markdown does. Alright, if we check things out in the browser now, things are no longer broken, and our Markdown appears on the page. Don't let the size of the H1 confuse you. That's just Tailwind stripping out the tag default styles. To prove it to you, let's inspect. And yeah, we can see the H1 there, along with the paragraph tag. And they're both wrapped in a div. As an extra tip, if you'd like to get Tailwind working well with rich text and Markdown, you can check out the Tailwind CSS typography plugin, and I've added a link to it in the description below. Okay, let's try out the wrapper element option. We'll say that we'd like to use a section instead of a div. When we inspect now, sure enough, we get the section. Awesome. Lastly, we can go make a change in the Markdown file and see Vite's hot module replacement automatically update the page. At this point, if this were a new and unique plugin, we could extract it to its own project and share it via npm, and we'd be good to reuse it in project after project. In conclusion, this is just one example of what you can do with Vite plugins. There are many other possibilities, and you can learn more about what's possible in the Vite docs linked below. Vite is next-generation tooling that is changing the front-end developer's experience for the better. And now, you are equipped to use it for your Vue.js projects. Congrats! I encourage you to start using Vite in your projects today and benefit from the lightning-fast development experience that allows for more efficient development, quicker feedback loops, and a better mental focus, all making you a better developer. If you want to learn even more about Vite or contribute to the Vite community, don't forget to bookmark the Vite docs as well as the awesome Vite repo. As always, we hope you enjoyed the course. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out via the comments, via email, or on Twitter, and I look forward to seeing you in the next course.